Village connects members with each other and with the resources we need to stay active, independent, and fulfilled. And this year we've been celebrating our 10th anniversary, and the depth and strength of our village has become keenly apparent during this extraordinary time. Volunteers continue to assist members with essential services and are making regular check-in calls to our members. We're offering an expanded assortment of live and recorded online programming, such as the event we're sharing today. So welcome. Last week, the Ashby Village Board of Directors committed itself to challenging institutional racism and to promoting greater inclusion in our village. A process of self-reflection and reassessment of the values, policies, practices, and strategies of Ashby Village has been instituted and will unfold in the coming months. Ashby Village leadership treasures the socioeconomic, racial, and cultural diversity in the East Bay, and we want our services and programs to be accessible to a broad range of older adults. Our It Takes a Village membership fund provides reduced fee memberships for low-income older adults who want to become members of our vital community. Membership dues cover approximately 60% of the revenue needed to operate our village, and with the balance coming from individual donors. While today's event is free for all to attend, Ashby Village relies on donations in order for us to present programs such as today's. So I've placed a donation link in the chat box for anyone interested in giving a gift, and we'll do so, I'll place it there at the end as well. Thanks so much for your support. And with all that said, I'd like to pass the screen now to Irene Marcos, a member of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture team that has created today's wonderful event.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Arts and Culture Group, I want to thank everyone for Zooming with us today. This will be our 13th presentation. It remains our intention to create 3 to 4 stimulating and informing talks per year. We are pleased and encouraged by the level of interest shown by our members, our volunteers, and our guests from the larger community. At our last count 2 days ago, we were close to expecting to have almost 200 guests with us for today's presentation. Thank you for supporting us with your presence. I've been a member of Ashby Village for the last 10 years, and I volunteered in different capacities since becoming a member. I spent the first 3 years focusing with Andy on the recruitment and training of our wonderful volunteers, many of whom are members. I continue volunteering as a member of the program leadership team and also as a member of the Schools and Communities First group, which is part of Elder Action. You will be hearing much more about our effort to get the vote out to pass legislation in November that will rectify the unfair property tax benefits enjoyed by a small group of very large commercial property owners. This passage will add up to $12 billion per year to the schools and communities in the state of California without raising property taxes on residential properties. We're so excited to have Adam Hochschild with us today. As many of you know, he is a gifted historical writer whose writing is infused with vivid character portrayals. At the end of Adam's remarks, we will have a 20-minute period for your questions. Please add your questions to the chat box for Adam to answer. I will be formulating the questions as we see them. Try to keep your questions short so that we can have time to answer as many of them as possible. Before we leave each other today, please plan on staying for some exciting news about the 3 upcoming talks that we have planned in July, September, and October. Joan Cole will be introducing Adam, but before Joan begins her introduction, I have the pleasure of introducing Joan. She became a member of Ashby Village 1 year prior to the actual launch. She has served as the chair of the Outreach Ambassadors team. Joan is a member of the Elder Action Steering Committee. She also serves as a liaison to the board for the program leadership team. Joan is one of our most treasured members here at Ashby Village. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you, Irene. What an honor and joy it is for me to introduce my dear friend, Adam Hochschild, a man whom I've come to love and deeply respect over a period of almost 30 years. When I began thinking about what I might tell you about Adam this afternoon, I went through a list of his amazing accomplishments. His books, awards, his work as a public historian and intellectual. Adam is the best-selling author of 10 books, which include King Leopold's Ghost, which sold two-thirds of a million copies worldwide, and was a finalist for the National Book Award and National Book Critics Circle Award. Adam writes for many publications, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, The Atlantic, and he regularly is invited to do special pieces for the New York Times. Most notably, he was the co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine, where he has provided significant leadership since its inception.
Oh, yes.
Many of his books take on tragic and violent events in history. Golden thread, which runs through them all. Adam has an eye for the moral moments of good people devoted to stopping bad news. I have to wonder what he'll be writing about the emerging social movement as we see giving birth in our streets and in this terribly critical moment in our history. But perhaps that's for another day. I hope so, Adam. If you haven't already done so, I urge you to dig deep into his writings because he has a most extraordinary ability to help us relive and see world history through a fresh lens. His voice is compelling, and his ideas authentically invite us to engage along with him in significant times with significant people, movers and shakers, as in King Leopold's Ghost. The horrors that have gone unnoticed by previous writers and historians. His strong verbal illustrations create an experience that is indelible, informative, and enduring. Never have we needed this probing and insightful perspective as we do at this critical moment. So finally, Adam, you're an extraordinary person to know. Adam brings a fresh perspective informed by deep research and thought. The book he is writing now, which is what he's going to speak with us about today, throws light on the profound social problems and widening schisms in that society and in our society. His current work follows closely on the heels of his last book, Rebel Cinderella, which was published in March 2020, just before the pandemic broke into our awareness. Like Rebel Cinderella, this current work helps us understand the influence of history on today's chaotic and deeply rooted political and social conflict. We are not just in the next phase of that history. We are living the result of it. Adam and his sociologist wife, Arlie, have contributed mightily to our understandings of the divisions and powerful forces of race, class, and political ideology, which are tearing our society apart. Both Arlie and Adam have given freely and generously to the Ashby Village community, and we are deeply grateful to them for that. So now I give you Adam, who professes to practice history without a license, but we know better. Adam?
Well, thank you very much, Joan. That was absolutely lovely. Consider yourself signed up to introduce me anytime I talk anywhere. I'm really grateful for all you said. It's a pleasure to be talking to Ashby Village. Usually a writer talks about a book that he's just written because he wants you to go out and buy it, and I'm happy to do that anytime. But what I want to talk about today is a book that I'm in the process of writing because I'm hoping that speaking with you about it will help me think out my ideas and form what I want to say. I want to begin by first describing the usual way we remember the period of time roughly 100 years ago, the time when America entered the First World War, and then look back at the aspects of that history that we ignore. And in the process, I think what unfolds is a very dark period in American life 100 years ago, and I call it a time that Trump would love because it was filled with attacks on immigrants, attacks on free speech, demands to deport people, right-wing vigilante violence, and press censorship on a large scale. Can you imagine Trump not enjoying such a time? So let's first talk about how this period is usually covered in American history books, the First World War. The way the World War I story is usually told, the European powers had been battling themselves to a stalemate for nearly 3 years. The British, the French, the Germans. The war had produced untold millions of deaths, an even larger number of wounded, destruction beyond that of any previous European war, a devastated landscape, and still the carnage went on, leaving the powers of the old world exhausted. The United States, meanwhile, was at peace, a country of virtuous small-town churchgoers and hardworking farmers. Then, the German submarines started sinking American ships. President Woodrow Wilson declared enough is enough, and on April 2nd, 1917, he went before Congress and asked it to declare war. Congress promptly did so. Wilson picked General John J. Pershing to lead the U.S. troops into battle. Pershing arrived in France and declared, "Lafayette, we are here." Some 2 million American troops followed him. They fought bravely. They helped win the war. And swiftly came the armistice, which was really a German surrender. And ticker tape parades welcomed the American troops home. Pershing was greeted as a great hero. Now, that's where the chapter on World War I and its aftermath in so many American history textbooks, the ones that you and I probably studied in school, ends. The country is at peace, and the next chapter of American history begins. The 1920s, flappers, prohibition, speakeasies, Babe Ruth, the Model T Ford, and so on, right? But this skips over a great deal. Let's go back and look at that period more closely. The war years, the year and a half that the United States was in the war, and then at the 2 years that followed. Now, I said that the image of the United States before it got into the war in 1917 was that it was a very peaceful country. But it wasn't. It was a tinderbox of tension with 3 big conflicts going on. One point of tension was tremendous hostility towards immigrants. Look at this sign, "No Irish need apply." I found signs, classified advertisements like this everywhere. A second conflict was the one that we are still living out today between whites and blacks. Most black people in the America of 1917 were doing miserable, low-paid work like picking cotton as sharecroppers, and most white people wanted to keep them in such jobs. Finally, a third internal war that was going on in the US was between capital and labor. It was an era of militant strikes that were violently suppressed. So these were the tensions in this not very peaceful country of ours when the United States entered the First World War in 1917. And entering that war was like pouring gasoline on flames because it gave the excuse to people who wanted to intensify all 3 of those conflicts. From the moment that the US entered the war, there was a fierce propaganda barrage from the government. Look, for example, at this US Army recruiting poster. There was also a terrifically encouraged by the government paranoia about spies. One reason people were paranoid about spies was because there was a huge part of the population that were foreign born. The first reflection of this, but by no means the last, the first reflection of this paranoia was fear of everything German, sometimes mixed in with a long-standing anti-Semitism. Look at this anti-spy poster. The man in it has a German helmet, but maybe a Jewish nose. Now, I heard about this atmosphere of the United States in 1917 and 1918 from my father, who was 25 years old in 1917, the son of a Jewish immigrant from Germany. The family spoke German at home, but they were terrified of doing so on the street. Some states had passed laws against speaking German in public. German language instruction stopped in schools and universities. Signs appeared, like this one at a park in Chicago. No danger to pro-Germans. Bonfires of German books happened all over the country. This one is outside a high school in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And here, next to the remains of the fire, someone has chalked on the sidewalk, here lies the remains of German in BHS, Baraboo High School. Robert Prager was a miner in Collinsville, Illinois. He tried to enlist in the US Navy to fight in the war, but he was turned down because he had a glass eye. He had the bad luck to be German born. One day in 1918, he was seized by a mob, wrapped in an American flag, made to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and lynched. Here are the people who lynched him. They were put on trial. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes and found them innocent, while a military band played outside the courthouse. Anti-German madness was expressed in other ways as well. No more German music was performed. Weddings happened without Mendelssohn's Wedding March. Names got changed. Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln. East Germantown, Indiana became Pershing, named after the general. Families named Schmidt became Smith. The Frankfurter became the hot dog. There was a ferocity in the air at the very highest level. For example, this is a picture of Elihu Root, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of War, former senator from New York, now in mid-1917 a special emissary of President Wilson. He told an audience in New York in the summer of 1917 that, quote, pro-German, quote, traitors, unquote, were threatening the war effort. And here's what he said. There are men walking about the streets of this city tonight who ought to be taken out at sunrise tomorrow and shot for treason. There are some newspapers published in this city every day, the editors of which deserve conviction and execution for treason. With his hatred of the media, he would be right at home in the Trump administration. And people like him were as fierce as they were about the war and about their version of patriotism because there was considerable resistance to the war. There was a group, for example, called the Women's Peace Party that agitated against the war both before and after the United States entered it. Here's an advertisement for an anti-war meeting that was to take place on the very eve of Wilson's speech to Congress. 2 days later, this organization's office, just 2 blocks away from the White House, was vandalized and smeared with yellow paint. There were popular anti-war songs. Here's one. I didn't raise my voice to be a soldier. There were some publications that took a strong anti-war stand, like this socialist newspaper in New York City. And a particularly strong voice against the war, and we'll come back to this, was a magazine called The Masses, the liveliest magazine in America at the time. It published John Reed, probably the best English language journalist in the world at that time, the young Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, many of the best writers of the day. In some ways, it was a precursor to the New Yorker. It published strong anti-war cartoons like this one, Christ being shot by soldiers, and if you look carefully at their hats, you can see they represent all of the principal armies on both sides of the war. Prominent political figures spoke out against the war, like the socialist leader, Eugene V. Debs, the perennial socialist candidate for president, and the charismatic anarchist leader, Emma Goldman, who started organizing against the draft. Several US senators were strongly anti-war, of whom the boldest was Robert La Follette from Wisconsin, staunch progressive all his life. And he asked, if this is a war to make the world safe for democracy, why not self-determination for Ireland, for Egypt, for India? He declared that you could still be a patriot and oppose a particular war, and pointed out that in the 19th century, both Daniel Webster and Abraham Lincoln had spoken out against the US war with Mexico. La Follette began receiving nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy at the University of Wisconsin. His fellow senators opened an investigation into whether he should be expelled from the Senate entirely. And Eugene Debs and Emma Goldman had worse fates. We'll come back to them. The government moved very quickly to suppress anti-war demonstrations ruthlessly. And anyone who refused military service was sent to prison or locked up in grim camps like this one at Camp Funston, Kansas. And many of these war resistors, when they wouldn't do the work that they were required to do as army prisoners, were shackled to cell bars for 9 hours a day, the time that they should have been working. And this drawing of that punishment was made by an artist who used to work for that magazine, The Masses, who himself endured this. Here's one such resistor, an anti-war activist and social worker named Roger Baldwin, who was sent to prison for his opposition to the draft. We'll come back to him. The government crackdown on dissent had help from vigilantes. Organizations sprang up around the country. The largest was something called the American Protective League, whose members got to wear badges like this. And if you see on the badge, it says that they are officially an auxiliary of the US Department of Justice. This organization was organized with Department of Justice support, and by the end of 1917, it had more than 250,000 members. It was made up largely of men who were too old to join the army, but who wanted to feel that they were fighting for their country at home. What did they do? Among other things, they carried out what were called slacker raids to find people who had not registered for the draft. Sometimes a slacker was somebody who had failed to buy a war bond, a supposedly voluntary act, and they were punished in various ways. And this vigilante violence, as I say, was done with the complete support of the government. Here are people who were rounded up, young men rounded up in a slacker raid in New York City in 1918, in which 60,000 people were detained because they weren't carrying their draft cards. But the slacker raids by the American Protective League were a comparatively mild side of vigilante violence in those years. Other expressions of it were much worse. Cartoons glorified this vigilante violence, and sometimes people acted on that. One such episode involved the Wobblies, members of the country's most militant labor group, the Industrial Workers of the World. This group of Wobblies, 17 of them, were beaten, tarred, and feathered in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What the article in this newspaper doesn't say is that one of the leaders of the masked vigilantes who carried out this action was the local police chief. I mentioned that these folks were tarred and feathers, here's what somebody looked like after being tarred and feathered in these years. John Meintz, a farmer in Luverne, Minnesota, was attacked by a group of masked men because he refused to buy a war bond. The men were put on trial, but found innocent. Somebody else, who was a wobbly member of the IWW, had a worse fate. He was seized from his bed in Butte, Montana, and hanged from a railroad bridge outside of town. Here's his body, Frank Little, 38 years old. His crime was coming to Butte, Montana to organize workers for the Wobblies in a mining town where an underground fire several weeks earlier had taken the lives of more than 160 miners. Which brings us to the point that the real target of repression during the war years was not really draft evaders or alleged pro-Germans. It was the left, and especially organized labor. For this was an era of tremendous labor strife. There were many strikes. Often they were put down by military force or by the police. That's a striking garment worker in Chicago being arrested. The war gave the federal government and big business the perfect excuse to crack down on the left and on organized labor in every possible way. And then another excuse came along, which was the Russian Revolution, the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks there. The American establishment was terrified at the prospect of this revolution spreading to the United States. And this is what intensified the political repression here and really led to what I think is the worst period of political repression in the United States since the end of slavery. And something I want to emphasize is that this political repression happened not just during the First World War, when the excuse for it was the war effort. It continued for some 2 years after the war, and it happened on several fronts. There was a series of laws passed, the most important of which was the Espionage Act of 1917. And among other things, it gave the government the power to censor the press. And the printed press, of course, at that time, newspapers and magazines, was the mass media of the day because this was before radio and television. Now, you remember the magazine The Masses that I talked about earlier. This is the cover of its August 1917 issue, which was its last. It was printed, but it was banned from the US mail. Why? Because the censors objected to several pieces of text and several cartoons. Here's one of the cartoons they objected to, which shows the Liberty Bell crumbling. So the best magazine in the country was forced to cease publishing. More than 400 issues of American newspapers and magazines were banned between 1917 and early 1921. 75 different publications were involved. Here's the guy who was America's chief press censor, Albert S. Burleson, the Postmaster General, because the law gave the power of press censorship to him because the postmaster, of course, supervised everything that went through the mail. He was a former congressman from Texas, actually the first Texan to ever serve in a cabinet, very conservative and arch segregationist. When he was born during the Civil War, his family actually owned 20 slaves. And he loved being the chief censor. Right after the armistice that ended the war, November 1918, President Wilson declared an end to censorship. The war was over. But Burleson paid no attention. He kept on banning publications he didn't like, and Wilson didn't seem to mind, paid very little attention, and on occasion backed him up. Another front on which the government moved was to jail critics of the war. I earlier showed you a picture of Eugene Debs, the socialist leader. Here he is as a federal prisoner, sentenced for speaking out against the war. Like many war critics, he was still in jail 2 years after the war ended. In November 1920, when he was convict number 9653, In the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he was the Socialist Party candidate for president and won more than 900,000 votes. He was far from the only person who was sent to jail for speaking against the war. Somebody else who was imprisoned was Kate Richards O'Hare, a fiery Socialist Party activist and orator. In prison, she became friends with Emma Goldman, the war opponent whom we talked about earlier, jailed for her activities. Goldman was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but after that, the government deployed another weapon against her. It deported her from the United States. She and 248 other radicals the government was eager to get rid of were shipped off to Russia just before Christmas of 1919 on this vessel, the troop ship Buford. Now, there's something that feels eerily familiar today. In 1919, the US was swept by a frenzy about deporting people. There were no less than 3 people eyeing the Democratic and Republican presidential nominations in 1920 who were campaigning on promises of mass deportations. When this deportation frenzy began in 1919, it was very stormy. The war was over, but during it, the cost of living had soared. The biggest strike wave in American history took place. 1 in 5 American workers went on strike during the year 1919. These Chicago police were called out because of a huge steelworkers strike. The year 1919 was also a year of some of the worst racial violence in American history. In fact, I've been recently doing some calculations. I believe in 1919, more Black Americans died violently as a result of racial violence than at any year since the end of slavery. Why? In part, it was because there were 380,000 returning Black war veterans, and they were competing for jobs with several million white veterans, and the jobs were scarce because war industries had shut down. It was a tough time to be a Black person in the United States, and some of the worst violence was in the North. These are white people in Chicago stoning a Black man. In several cities, martial law was declared and the National Guard or state militia called out, like these soldiers questioning a man on the street in Chicago. There were a number of lynchings that year, in fact, the largest number of lynchings in a decade, and some of them were in the North. A Black man got lynched in Omaha, Nebraska, and the white mayor of the town, who attempted to save him, was strung up himself. He was cut down, badly injured just in time by the police, but the man he was trying to save was not so lucky. Martial law was declared in Omaha and in a number of other cities in 1919. More than 70 Black Americans were lynched that year. The total death toll of the 1919 racial violence was in the hundreds, and all but a handful of the dead were Black. I mentioned that various people hoping to campaign for the president that year were doing so on a platform of deporting people. And one of them was the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer. We remember his name best in connection with the so-called Palmer raids of late 1919 and early 1920, in which an estimated 10,000 radicals were arrested, mainly those that Palmer hoped could be deported because they were not American citizens. You remember there were a huge number of foreign-born Americans at that time, well over 10 million. And many people had never bothered to get officially naturalized as an American citizen at a time when the country seemed to be welcoming immigrants. But under the law, they could be deported if they were judged to be members of an organization that advocated violence against the government. Here are some of the Palmer raid victims rounded up and awaiting deportation at Ellis Island in 1919, a place that had previously been the port through which immigrants hoping for a new life in the United States had entered. In the course of these Palmer raids, the raiders, who were federal agents helped by local police and by these volunteer vigilantes, also seized and destroyed radical literature. These are some federal agents and local police with a haul of radical literature in Boston. The Justice Department agents and local police took these occasions to trash the offices of the radical groups where they made their arrests. This is the New York City office of the IWW, the Wobblies. And note that they were proud enough of having done this that they invited news photographers to come and take pictures of their handiwork. There was, however, an unexpected hero of this dark time. His name was Louis F. Post, and he was the acting Secretary of Labor. Now, why was that important? The arrests of the people that the Red Hunter Palmer wanted deported were carried out by the Justice Department. But as it happened, deportations had to be approved by the Immigration Bureau, and that fell under the Labor Department. And Post was a decent man who was outraged by the idea that thousands of people might be deported from the United States because of their political opinions. And he was in a position of power. He was also a skilled bureaucrat, a trained lawyer, an ardent progressive, and he let thousands of these jailed people awaiting deportation out of jail. He found legal problems with warrants, and he invalidated the vast majority of them. He was able to save several thousand people from being deported. These actions attracted the rage of somebody who was the real architect of the Palmer raids, a 24-year-old bureaucrat in the Justice Department named J. Edgar Hoover, who in mid-1919 had become head of the Justice Department's radical division. Hoover was furious that his and Palmer's plans for deporting all these folks were stopped by Post. He prepared a dossier against Post. He got the American Legion to demand Post's firing, got Congress to investigate Post, but Post held on. Hoover lost his battle with Post, but went on to win many others. He really got his start in these years and greatly enlarged government infiltration and surveillance of radical groups, something that would remain in place for a century to come. It even included the planting of agents provocateurs. For example, here's a front page of a newspaper in Pittsburgh about some people who were arrested in an alleged bomb plot by the IWW in 1919. 3 suspects. You can see their photos on the front page of the newspaper. But look a little more closely at the one at the upper right. He was the secretary of the local Wobbly branch, supposedly named Leo Walsh. But in fact, his real name was Louis M. Wendell, and he was Agent 836 of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI. For 2 years, he'd been active in the Wobbly branch in Pittsburgh, periodically slipping away to meet personally with Hoover in Washington or New York and brief him. And some of what these Pittsburgh Wobblies were accused of doing was actually instigated by Walsh. Another aspect of these very repressive years, 1917 to 1920, is not only did the Justice Department greatly increase its spying on progressive activists of all sorts, but so did the American military. The key figure here was an officer named Lieutenant Colonel Ralph H. Van Diemen. As soon as the United States entered the war, he set up a huge domestic intelligence operation. Within a year, he had more than 1,000 people working for him, both military and civilian. He moved on, but military intelligence spying on civilians continued for decades. I was active in the anti-war movement in the 1960s. I suspect many of you listening were as well. Under the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get records that Army intelligence had on, as they kept such records on thousands of American civilians, going back to 1919, 1920, when it started. The military in this era was very worried about trouble coming from many sources, and they thought about it in ethnic terms. Italians were possible anarchists. Jews were possible socialists and communists. Irish were possible Irish Republican Army sympathizers. Black Americans were an all-around threat to be contained. And here's a reflection of how military intelligence in this era thought about such ethnic issues.
Adam, I want
Yep.
to ask you to pause 1 second. There's a whine that's happening and people are asking you to speak up a little bit. The whine stopped and I'm not sure why, but so maybe just raise your voice and continue on. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll come a little closer to the microphone. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. The whine is still there, but
You think it's coming from my microphone?
stop talking for a second. Yeah, I think it is. It is when you're speaking, but I don't know if there's no, it's okay. Just slightly distracting.
I could unplug. I'm using an auxiliary mic. Let me unplug it and just see how it sounds when I'm just the mic in my computer.
That's
okay.
good.
Now, is that any better?
No, it's still there. Huh. Yeah, I think it's our guest, unwelcome guest, but it's just speak up a little bit and carry on.
What if I hold the mic right up to my mouth? Does that help?
No.
Oh dear.
It's okay. I think if you just speak up, it'll just be in the background.
Okay. Well, I only have a few more slides here. Anyway, what I'm showing you on the screen now is part of an ethnic map of New York City made by military intelligence, showing the northeastern corner of Manhattan. It was prepared by military intelligence for New York in 1919. It's color-coded by ethnicities, where people live. B, or red, is Russian Jews. C, brown, is Italians. Dark gray is Negro, as black people were called then. The bluish areas lettered E were Irish Americans. The numbers on the map refer to union halls, IWW offices, and the like. And the stars with numbers are offices of suspicious publications, which range from the NAACP magazine to socialist newspapers in English and other languages. So this is kind of a reflection of how the military thought about American politics in that era. The military fear of uprising was so great that the Army prepared a contingency plan for putting the entire United States under martial law, complete with the wording of the proclamation that the president should issue in such a case. This is the wording of the proclamation. Happily, things did not reach that point, but it's a reminder of how close to the brink we came. Basically, several things happened that stilled the hysteria. By the early 1920s, the economy picked up, the unemployment rate dropped. The Russian Revolution did not spread to the United States. The militant wing of the labor movement had been essentially crushed by this repressive period, and so the right-wingers in the government were no longer so worried about it. But those who had been active against the war and against the repression didn't stay quiet. I showed you a picture earlier of the young social worker sent to prison for refusing the draft, Roger Baldwin. Here he is many years later outside the Supreme Court, an institution on which he had a huge impact. because he became the founder and moving spirit for decades of the American Civil Liberties Union. Remember Kate Richards O'Hare, the jailed anti-war activist I mentioned earlier? When she was released from prison when her term expired, she led a cross-country march demanding the release of other political prisoners, picketed the White House for 2 months with the support of the ACLU, and she was finally successful. In 1921, Warren Harding became president, and finally, in response to those demonstrations, he let all remaining political prisoners out of jail. And he even invited Eugene Debs to visit him in the White House on his way home from prison. Here's Debs leaving the White House after that visit. He joked that he'd run for president 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten to the White House. So what can we conclude about this era? I think it was a time when American democracy came very close to losing its soul, a feeling some of us have had about these last few years. And it's a reminder of the dark currents of xenophobia and eagerness to hunt for scapegoats that have long run below the surface in this country and which still run there and which are sometimes visible today. So what can we conclude? I think it's a good time to remember the words that Emma Goldman said in court before she was sentenced to prison for her opposition to the war. Here's what she said. Gentlemen of the jury, of course at those times there were no women on juries. Gentlemen of the jury, we respect your patriotism, but may there not be different kinds of patriotism? Our patriotism is that of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. It was a good definition of patriotism then, and I think it still is today. So I'm going to stop right there, and I would be glad to hear any comments or questions that you have.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. Hello, everyone. My name is Soo-Yin Bickner. I'm the project coordinator here at Ashby Village. Let me try and unmute our other panelist, Irene, to see if she can help with some of our questions.
I can help.
Okay, and can you see the chat now, Irene?
And yes, thank you.
Great.
You.
Let me make a quick statement before you start. I know we've had some audio issues. Thank you for bearing with us. This is our first Zoom webinar. This is being recorded as well, so we will be putting this online on our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and search for Ashby Village, this will be there, as well as all of our other programming. We have a special playlist called Apart But Not Alone, which focuses on all of our special presentations we've done during the shelter in place. So with that, Irene, can you help us through some of these questions?
I can, yes. Thank you, Soo-Yin. And thank you, Adam. You know, personally, your talk has helped me understand what was going on in this country when my mother and father settled here. So I thank you. The first question that we got was, and I'll read it, a number of the activities you talked about earlier in the presentation took place in Chicago. Was that because much of it happened there, or because there's good documentation of it there?
Well, a lot of it did happen there because Chicago was a big industrial center. It was a center of the steel strike in 1919. It was the center of other strikes. But this kind of thing did happen all over the country.
Second question, were there no conscientious objectors to war during the period you're discussing? Was it illegal to be a pacifist?
There were conscientious objectors, and one of the people I showed you a picture of, the guy Roger Baldwin, who became the founder of the ACLU, was one. The government had a fairly narrow definition of conscientious objector, but it gave you that status if you were willing to do alternative work, but that alternative work to fighting in the war could be, working in war industries or driving an ambulance at the front or something like that. There were a small number of people who refused to do that, and they were called absolutists because they had an absolute conviction that they did not want to be part of the war effort in any way. Estimates vary on the numbers. 500 to 800 is the figure that most people seem to agree on. And these were the folks who were thrown in these military prisons and treated very, very harshly, chained up to their cell bars and that kind of thing.
When will the book be published?
Oh, I won't be finished writing it, I think, for another 2 years or so. And then it takes a publisher usually close to a year to publish a book after you turn in the manuscript. So not for a few years.
We have a bit to wait, huh?
Yeah.
How do you decide what to write about? How do you do your research?
Now that I could talk about all afternoon.
Hi.
I decide what to write about when a subject grabs my interest and doesn't let go. And often it's because I get fascinated by a particular person. Often I get fascinated by something that seems to me horrible or remarkable, and why is it nobody knows about it? The book of mine that Joan mentioned that sold the most copies, I think, is King Leopold's Ghost, about the colonization of the Congo. And this was an episode of history in which the population of that territory shrank by 10 million people. And I wondered, why did nobody know about this? And that's what set me to exploring it and realizing that at the time it was going on, it was the #1 human rights scandal in the world. And then the question becomes, why did it get forgotten? And so you have to look at the forces there. So a subject sort of grabs hold of me, and then I try to find out everything about it that I possibly can. And I feel very blessed to live in Berkeley because I'm in walking distance of the University of California Library, which has 11 million items in its collection. And that's enough to get you started on your research, let me tell you. When you're researching things that happened, 100 years ago, you're reliant almost entirely on written material. If you're writing about something that happened more recently, you can go out and interview people. But unfortunately, there's nobody around that I can go talk to who lived through the experience of being a conscientious objector or a wobbly or something during World War I. So how do I do the research? I look for places where I can find people's voices. Sometimes that means in publications of the time. Very often it means in letters that people write each other, where people are much more blunt about what they feel than what they say in public. So please keep your letters. Do a favor for future historians and give us material to work from. Even better, keep a diary. Diaries become tremendously revealing. Another kind of information I like to work from, where you can hear people's voices, is the records of people like this undercover agent, Louis Wendell, whom I mentioned. All of his reports to the Bureau of Investigation are available for people to look at now. So I can read these, get some sense of this man, get some sense of how pleased he was to have infiltrated this organization, how he boasted about his closeness to the people there and going out drinking with his fellow wobblies in the evening and so forth. All of this stuff that was being read by J. Edgar Hoover. So that's a wonderful collection of material that's somebody's voice there.
Next question is, how long did it take to recover a bit? Did the Great Depression help?
Well, I think in a way, the United States both did recover and didn't recover from this period I'm talking about, the 1970, 1920. Press censorship stopped. And ironically, it was stopped by the Republican administration of Warren Harding, whom we usually think of as a crook, which he was, rather than a particularly noble president. He was also the one who let the political prisoners out of jail. But racial violence certainly didn't stop. The Tulsa massacre, which we've been reading about in the last few days because President Trump rescheduled the rally that he was going to have in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was probably the worst single incident in terms of death toll of racial violence in the United States since the Civil War. That happened in 1921, really after the end of this period. I think the United States became a different country in the 1930s, and a lot of that had to do with who was president at that time. Imagine the 1930s, the period of the Great Depression, if Trump had been president then. Instead, we were lucky to have somebody like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who really cared about democracy, cared about putting people back to work, was more interested in that than in enriching the pockets of his corporate cronies, was willing to try everything to get the economy moving again. And I think that, in part, that era is responsible for a lot of the good things about the United States today and basic reforms like the Social Security system, which we all depend on today.
What part did you see Eleanor Roosevelt playing?
In the 1930s? A lot. Again, I would ask you, imagine Melania Trump as First Lady during that period. I'm so glad we had Ellen. Wouldn't have minded her as president as well, or co-president.
Yes. Can you please talk more about the overwhelming racism of those years?
Well, I think basically when the Civil War ended, white people in the American South didn't really resign themselves to the fact that slavery was over. And they made this clear by the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, by the practice of lynching, which continued, an incredibly brutal practice, which, all told took something like more than 4,000 lives in documented cases of lynching in the United States, Black lives, and there were probably more than that weren't documented. And these happened at a rate of 50, 60, 70 a year, really from about 10 years after the Civil War into the 1920s. Then the rate dropped off a bit, but they still happened. So this was a terror directed at Black people in the American South. One result of that, of course, was the Great Migration of Blacks from the South to the North, the Midwest, the Far West, that began in 1910 and accelerated over the next decades. But of course, that was not a smooth process because these Black people looking for an end to terror and a better life for themselves came to cities where white populations, often recently arrived immigrants, were not happy to have them, and where unscrupulous real estate agents tried to scare white neighborhoods into selling their homes, saying the Blacks are coming, the Blacks are coming. So there was a tremendous amount of racial violence that followed from that. In Chicago, just in a couple of years before, like 1915 to 1919, there were 24 Black homes that were firebombed. Nobody was ever arrested and convicted. And these were often homes where a Black family had moved into a white neighborhood. So this tension, this hatred has been there in the United States for a long time. And of course, it's something we've all been thinking about again in the last couple of weeks.
Was the time that you've been discussing with us as bad as the earlier Alien and Sedition Acts?
Alien Sedition Acts, you mean around, when was that, late 1700s, 1800 or so. I think it was certainly a more violent time than that earlier period, just because in that earlier time, I don't think the United States was as roiled by the rage against immigrants. It was so much in the air around the time of the First World War. Of course, back then, around 1800, slavery was in place, which was certainly a tremendously violent institution for the people enslaved by it. But the violence associated with that did not spread to cities in the North. So in a way, I think of the later period as the more violent time.
How did the last pandemic, 1919, feed into the era?
Good question, because of course it happened just during that time. I think a couple of thoughts there. One is that it was a terrible piece of luck that the pandemic hit the country during a period of press censorship. It wasn't so much a matter, as far as I can tell, but this is something I'm still researching, of the Postmaster General, who was the chief press censor, actually telling newspapers you can't print anything about the pandemic. But there's certainly a lot of evidence that the military authorities tried to keep news of the pandemic's toll on army bases, which was one of the places where it hit worst, tried to keep that out of the press because this was looked on as information that might help the enemy. If the Germans knew that soldiers were dying by the hundreds every week at a number of army bases around the US, it was thought that, this might be news that would encourage them. Of course, soldiers were dying at German army bases also. Soldiers died by the hundreds on troop ships going to Europe and were buried at sea. All of this news was kept out of the press because of wartime censorship. But of course, people knew it was happening. There were more than 600,000 Americans who died in the pandemic, a number 6 times greater than the death toll of those in the military, the First World War. And actually more than half of those who died in the military actually died of influenza. So there were really 12 times as many Americans died of influenza as died of combat deaths in the First World War. Everybody knew somebody who had died. And I think this just added to the general anxiety, a high level of anxiety of the time, and the absence of honest news about this in the press certainly did not help.
Our next question is, aside from the economic resurgence, what can we learn from that time that can help us get out of the current repressive environment?
Well, I mentioned this extraordinary figure of Louis F. Post, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, who saved thousands of people from being deported, because I think it's an example of how sometimes civil servants who do their job can prevent injustice from taking place. I, felt the same way about those very brave civil servants who testified during Trump's impeachment inquiry, for example, like the Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman. So that's certainly something that we can learn. We need to support whistleblowers, have stronger legislation, I think, than we do now to support them. I think the role of a feisty and independent press is tremendously important, more now than ever, especially when there are such tools for manipulating public opinion that are available to governments and to anybody who has the money to start a TV network like Fox, for instance.
Next question is, what happened to women's suffrage during the period that you were discussing?
Well, women did get the vote in 1920, and that was certainly an enormous step forward. I think it would be, I certainly think that was a long, long overdue step that the United States had to take. I'm not sure one could argue that it changed the political complexion of the country drastically as a result, because the 1920s was a fairly conservative era. But it did happen during this time, and I think the fact that there were, women demonstrating for suffrage outside the White House and so forth, it emboldened people to speak up on other issues as well.
Well, this must be from someone who was born in San Francisco, perhaps. What was going on in San Francisco at that time?
I think the same kinds of things as were happening elsewhere in the country. San Francisco was a big labor town. There were many strikes. It wasn't until the 1930s, though, that there was actually a general strike in San Francisco. I can't answer you specifically about things in San Francisco in that era, but maybe by the time I finish my work 2 years from now, I'll have a better answer for you on that score.
Well, we can look forward to that.
Good.
Was it just the recovering economy that saved the democracy, or were there progressive groups pressing for it? What does this say about our current slide away from democracy and our future?
Well, I think it's hard to make too many analogies between something that happened 100 years ago and today. But I do think, just answering the question for back then, that the recovering economy did help, because times when there is economic distress, high unemployment, and so forth, are always times that are ripe for demagogues. I think sometimes they can also be times that are ripe for big steps forward, as I think did happen during the 1930s in the United States, largely because of who we had in the White House at that time. So that was certainly one thing that brought it to an end. Also, the fact that the United States is, for better or for worse, a profoundly unrevolutionary country, and the Russian Revolution did not catch on here, as it seemed to be catching on at various places in Western Europe in this period, I think reassured people that some of these drastic measures weren't so necessary. But remember, 1919 was a time when, as I mentioned, 1 out of every 5 American workers went on strike. There was a general strike in Seattle, the first general strike in US history. There was a general strike across the border in Winnipeg, Canada. And so the authorities were really worried that the whole country might go up in flames. And that's why, the military prepared this contingency plan for putting the country under martial law if necessary. Several particular cities were under martial law briefly during this time in the process of suppressing strikes, especially the strike of the steelworkers. Gary, Indiana was under martial law, so was Cleveland for a time.
What happened to people who were deported to Russia? Emma Goldman and others, did they come back to us?
No, they were not allowed to come back. Emma Goldman spent the remaining 20 years of her life outside the United States. She spent 2 years in Russia. She was sent there on that ship with the others that you saw a picture of the ship. She was initially, like many, many people on the left, enormously optimistic. The Tsar had been overthrown. There was a new regime. The Soviet government was promising to do all kinds of great things. Goldman, however, was very smart. She took a look around when she got to Russia, where she spent 2 years. It helped that she spoke Russian. She saw that this was a horror show. It was not the paradise that she and others had expected. She left after a little less than 2 years in Russia, wrote a book called My Disillusionment with Russia, which infuriated many of her American friends who were still thinking it was paradise over there. She spent the remainder of her life in exile. She was allowed one exception where she came back to the United States for, I think, a 40-day period, but it was strictly a limited period. So she lived the rest of her life in Europe and in Canada. Her ashes were returned to the US to be buried, though, if I remember correctly.
Well, the next comment starts with, today is Donald of the Bone Spurs' birthday. And then a question, should we send this presentation to him as a gift?
Sure. It is his birthday. Amazing. Wow.
Yes, our Donald of the Bone Spurs. Question, where did you grow up? What sparked your interest in history? And how old were you then?
I don't know if I'm going to answer the question about how old I am. It was how old
No,
am I now?
no, how old were you then when you
Oh.
became interested in history?
Okay. Well, I tell you, I think I was born in New York City, lived there till I was 8 years old. Then my family moved to New Jersey, but I still sort of feel New York is the capital of the world. Although I've lived happily in the Bay Area for 50 or 60 years. I think my interest in history and in progressive politics generally is in large part a result of coming of age during the 1960s. And I'm sure this is true for a lot of you who are part of this event today. I think it was impossible to be a young person in the 1960s, a thinking, feeling young person, and not feel some of the extraordinary feelings going through the country at that time. A sense of being made aware of the deep injustices in American life by the civil rights movement. I saw people, my college classmates and others who were around me going off on freedom rides through the South. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I were briefly civil rights workers in Mississippi. And then, of course, like every young man in that era, I faced the question of the draft. I didn't have bone spurs. And any of us who didn't have an excuse like that were, of course, faced with the question of, are you going to allow yourself to be drafted or not? What kind of decision are you going to make that? And that concentrates the mind wonderfully on the whole question of whether that war we were fighting in Vietnam was something worth risking your life in or not. So those were some of the things that drew me into progressive politics and into wanting to write about issues of social justice, both in the present day and historically. I enjoy writing about history because sometimes when you look back 50 or 100 years, it's easier to see things a little more clearly than you can in the present. But every once in a while, especially when I get a chance to travel somewhere interesting or whatever, I will revert to my previous life as a journalist and write about things that are going on around us right now.
Could you speak a little more on the idea of patriotism commonly expressed today and how patriotism should be considered? You spoke briefly on the fact that one can object to war and still be patriotic. Is there a way to try and separate violence from patriotism?
Of course there is. I mean, I think of patriotism as the part of loving your country is wanting to make it better, wanting to make it a fairer place, a more just place, a country with a place for everybody, no matter their background, their skin color, anything else. That to me is the highest form of patriotism. And I in no way want to let people who feel differently take over the idea of patriotism. And I think at a moment like this, when the events of the last few weeks have put such a sense of the injustice that remains in America in the air, it's important that as we agitate about these issues, we feel patriotic and don't let other people take over that flag. It belongs to all of us, and it belongs to those of us who want to make this a more just country, a more fair country.
Thank you, Adam. How did property ownership laws and restrictions, the property ownership laws and restrictions of 1917 to 1920 affect politics and voting outcomes?
Oof. I am not sure if I know enough to answer that. You know, there was not a property qualification in the right to vote, you know, which there has been in some countries at some times. Property law certainly allowed for all kinds of racial covenants to be put on property. You know, you couldn't sell to a black person or a Jewish person or something. And that certainly added to the tensions in the air. Beyond that, I don't know. I'm going to have to go back to the law books and study to be able to answer that question better, I'm afraid.
What role did the influenza pandemic play in this narrative? I think you kind of, didn't you address that?
We talked about that.
Yeah, I thought so. Why does your book stop in 1920?
Because it's usually hard to get people to read a book that's longer than 300 or 350 pages, because obviously you could continue indefinitely, but it would be many volumes. And I think you don't want to read many volumes. You have to put an end to a story somewhere. And I'm always very aware of what is the proper length for a book. I teach a workshop at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. I teach a workshop for people who are writing nonfiction books. And in my very first class each semester, I say, I'm going to give you an important lesson in book writing before, you know, in 5 minutes. And we're going to do it in 1 minute. And so we're going to do it by a show of hands. And I ask for a show of hands of people in the room. How many of you have read a nonfiction book which you think is pretty good, but it was maybe 100 pages too long? And every hand goes up. How many of you have read a nonfiction book that you thought was pretty good and you wished was 100 pages longer? No hands go up. So I always think about that when I'm writing a book. Where to stop is very important.
Next question is, whatever happened to Robert La Follette? My parents who lived in Wisconsin were big fans.
He was actually, you know, they almost expelled him from the Senate in 1917 and 1918 because there was this furious, narrow type of patriotism in the air, and somebody who spoke against the war was despised by his fellow senators. People shouted at him on the Senate floor. They opened an investigation, should he be expelled? But then in the elections of 1918, La Follette, curiously enough, was a Republican. There were a lot of very progressive types in the Republican Party at that time. And the Republicans won the Senate by a very narrow margin in 1918. So it was no longer expedient to expel any Republican from the Senate. So the investigation immediately got dropped, and he was back in the sort of grudging good graces of his fellow Republicans. And then he was reelected to the Senate a couple of years later, and he died in office in 1925. His son was then elected senator from Wisconsin and played a good and important role in defending labor rights in the 1930s.
What about the violence and exclusion of Asian immigrants in the 1800s and the effect of the 1924 Immigration Act?
Well, the exclusion acts against Asian immigrants were really the first of a series of ever more repressive immigration laws in this country. One of the things, and there were exclusion acts that sharply limited the number of Asians allowed into this country for a long time before this period that I'm writing about. one of the things that was going on during this period, as I mentioned, it was a time of great anti-immigrant hysteria, and there were politicians who built their careers on advocating for severe restrictions on immigration. One of them was a congressman from Washington State, Albert Johnson, a terrible human being who had actually been part of a vigilante group that went around beating up wobblies when he was a young man. And he was the co-author of the 1924 Immigration Act, which was extremely restrictive and which dramatically slashed the number of new immigrants allowed into this country, and did it in a very curious way, where these very small numbers of immigrants who were allowed to come in were allotted country by country on the basis of how many Americans had their ancestry in that particular country. But it was not how many Americans in the most recent census, which would have been 1920, had their ancestry in a particular country. Rather, they used the census of 1890 as the standard. Why? Because 1890 was really before the period when large numbers of Jews and Italians and other people from Southern, Jews, Italians, Poles, other people from Southern and Eastern Europe came to the United States. And all of this anti-immigrant hysteria was directed at keeping out anybody who wasn't Anglo-Saxon, essentially. And that 1924 Act prevailed until it was finally revised and loosened a great deal in the 1960s.
How would you compare our current political situation to the one we have been describing, the one you've been describing in terms of hope for the future of our democracy? Is this another wave that will pass, or are we on a trajectory?
Well, I feel a lot of hope right now, especially after these last couple of weeks, because I think that the anti-immigrant hysteria, the steady diet of racism and demagoguery that Trump has been peddling, he's not been selling it very well the last few weeks. The great majority of the population, or at least a considerable majority, seems to differ from him on some very important issues. And to me, the most encouraging thing about the last week or two is that even some Republican senators, a very, very, very timid group of people indeed, have been willing to differ from him on some of these questions about race and police reform and so forth. And they're doing so because they're reading the tea leaves about their chances of being reelected. So I'm feeling kind of encouraged at the moment. Everything could change, you know. I wish the election were tomorrow. Heaven knows what's going to happen between now and November. But at the moment, I'm feeling more encouraged than I have been for quite a while.
We would all like to feel as encouraged as you are describing. This is a very difficult time for all of us, as we know. Well, I think we have answered all of the questions, asked and answered all of the questions. Yeah. Adam, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening, both where I'm guessing that many people that heard you today are looking forward to the publication of this book.
Well,
So on behalf of the members and the volunteers and the larger community, thank you very much again for sharing your afternoon with us. It's really been a pleasure.
Okay. Take care. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now for our exciting news about the speakers for our next presentations. On July 26th, Connie Schultz, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for her nationally syndicated columns, will be joining us. Her columns shine with her love and respect for the hardworking people in America's heartland. She has just published her first novel to acclaim, The Daughters of Erie-Town. It tells the story of her working class family roots in Ohio, and she is the proud wife of Senator Sherrod Brown. Democrat of Ohio. And I know she's proud of being his wife. I heard her on CNN the other night, and she talked about the fact that he's read her book 4 times. So she was very pleased by that. In September, we're going to be welcoming Robert Reich. His newest book, The System, Who Rigged It? How to Fix It. Mr. Reich is an economist, professor, and author. He served in the administrations of Presidents Ford, Carter, and Clinton. He was Secretary of Labor from 1993 to 1997 in the Clinton administration. He was also an advisor to the Obama administration. In October, we're looking forward to hosting our newest California State Treasurer, Fiona Ma. She was elected with more votes for this office than any other candidate in the history of our state. Treasurer Ma is the first Asian American elected to this office. She states that her greatest goal is to recognize the future and make sure it is distributed evenly. She is in a great position to do so since she oversees more than $2 trillion of revenue. So please plan on joining us again for what promises to be a very lively and interesting season of presentations. Thanks again for all the support and for Zooming with us. Apologies for any glitches. We're going to get better at this. This is our first Zoom presentation, and we look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Thank you.